In this video, we're going to talk about key terms related to discourse. So let's start with discourse itself. Generally, that just is a term for spoken or written communication, but specifically in this context, we're talking about discourse as the cultural conversation about a topic within a discourse community. Literature is part of that cultural conversation, and when we're analyzing literature in relationship to culture, discourse is a really important medium for helping us make the connection between the two. A discourse community is a group of individuals that shares a common understanding based on principles of communication or vocabulary within a specific discursive situation. Discursive is just the adjective form of discourse. There are lots of examples of discourse communities. They can be very broad or very narrow. Students in a specific class could be a discourse community. Those students have had experiences and talked about things that other people outside the class wouldn't know or recognize. So they have developed a special understanding and maybe even certain terminology that the outside world wouldn't necessarily know. So they would constitute a discourse community. We could also think more broadly. People living in a certain country are going to have a different discourse community than others. So the way that we think and talk about things here in the United States could be very different than the way people think and talk about those same things in another country. And you can even have discourse communities on the basis of other elements, like your profession could determine your discourse community, or it could be one of the discourse communities that you participate in. All of us are part of lots of different discourse communities. So when we're talking about discourse, we're talking both about elements that have to do with language itself and with cultural conversation. When we're talking about language and discourse, we do need to literally identify what language we're using, and that is going to be part of identifying the discourse. But we can also think about things like non-standard uses of language, like slang terms can be important in certain discourse communities. You know, different professions will have different slang that's used or technical language that's used. And even things like different hobbies that you do could have different sets of words that are recognizable there and not in other circumstances. I'm sure you can think of examples. The discourse also has to do with the conventions, how we put that language together, grammar, the rules of use. Those things are important in understanding the discourse as well. When we're talking that cultural conversation, that's where we get into ideas, concepts, issues. So those things are also part of our analysis of discourse, but we need both pieces. You know, looking at specific details of language as well as understanding the topics and the cultural conversations that are being engaged in. Okay, so what are the types of discourse? The first one is dominant discourse, and that is the prevailing view about a certain topic within a discourse community. It's really important to identify the discourse community you're talking about before trying to figure out what the dominant discourse is, especially when that discourse community may be distant from you in terms of culture or time. Also remember that we're talking about the prevailing view by the average people who are participating in the discourse community. What that means is dominant discourses don't necessarily have to align with things like science or fact. They just have to be the assumed idea, the assumed opinion about something within a specific discourse community. So just keep that in mind. We're not promoting any specific dominant discourse by identifying it, but we do need to be aware that the dominant discourses don't always align with what we may believe, especially, like I said, when we're analyzing discourse communities who are distant from us in terms of culture and time. Competing discourses are cases where there's no dominant view and two or more opinions or ideas about a topic compete for dominance. In the case of a competing discourse, those competing ideas are competing to become the dominant discourse in the discourse community. Sometimes that will happen. Sometimes one discourse will win out over the others and become the dominant view, and we'll look at an example where that was the case, in fact. But it's also possible for a discourse to simply remain competing, where no dominant view can emerge or does emerge, and so it just remains for a very long time a competing discourse. And the last one we're going to look at is subversive discourse, and that's a situation where a non-dominant position on a topic actively works to destabilize the dominant discourse. So you might have a small group that's part of a broader discourse community, or even a large group that simply holds a view that is not held by the dominant culture in a community. And they are crafting a discourse that is opposed to a specific dominant discourse and working to destabilize and even replace that dominant discourse. So when you're analyzing subversive discourse, it's really important to identify the dominant discourse that subversive discourse is reacting to. Let's take a look at an example of dominant discourse. For the discourse community, we'll take the contemporary United States. The discourse: everyone should have a cell phone, right? I think it's pretty non-controversial to say the accepted view in our contemporary United States culture is that cell phones are great and people should have them. I think, you'd be surprised to find someone who, not, hey, I just forgot it somewhere, but literally doesn't have a cell phone. I think you'd be surprised to find a person who doesn't have a cell phone. So that's a pretty easy example of a dominant discourse. It's an assumption. Now, it's not to say that every single member of that discourse community believes that, simply that it's the prevailing view among, the broad spectrum of that discourse community. Just in general, if you walk up to a person and say, hey, do you have a cell phone? They're going to say yes, because generally speaking, the idea is that everyone should have a cell phone. This discourse, though, wasn't always a dominant discourse. When cell phones were first starting to become popular, there was actually quite a robust competing discourse about whether or not they were safe. So I have here just a snippet of an article from November 30th, 2000 from the Dallas Tribune. Look at what it's saying there in the first few paragraphs. Experts agree there's little conclusive evidence to link mobile phone use to diseases such as cancer, but that's where the consensus ends. Critics of the wireless industry say studies have found enough troubling evidence to warrant caution and limited cell phone use, but other scientists agree that the majority of reports show consumers have little to fear. And it goes on like this, and you can see that there are two clear positions put across even in just that second paragraph, and the whole article goes back and forth about these different things and brings in experts on both sides. This is a really good example of when the idea of using cell phones was a competing discourse in our culture. And that's just, like 20 years ago. And in that time, that discourse has radically changed to become what we just talked about. The idea that, of course, everyone has a cell phone, and I don't think anyone really talks about getting cancer from using a cell phone anymore, not in a serious way, and not as a prevailing view in the dominant discourse. All right, what about subversive discourse? Let's take an example from history. The suffrage movement, which is about 100 years ago that women got the vote, so I thought that might be a good example to look at. So this is a political cartoon from back in the early 20th century, when that idea of women voting was still quite controversial. The discourse community here then is the early 20th century in the United States, and the dominant discourse is that women are not capable of voting. This cartoon represents a subversive discourse, that is, women are capable and should have the right to vote. And look at how this is represented here. A government of the people, by the people, for the people. And then the caption at the bottom reads, "Are not women half the nation?" So basically invoking women's basic humanity and saying, look, if we're talking about a government of the people, how is it that we're disenfranchising half of the people? Specific visuals are very telling too. The woman on her knees begging Uncle Sam for this opportunity to vote. She's wearing manacles or handcuffs, and she's wearing a sash. I mean, sort of a sash, but it's kind of around her waist, that says unenfranchised, meaning she has no right to vote. So that would be an example. That movement was an example of a subversive discourse. Let's contrast this image with another image. So this one is, and this is that same question of women voting. In this case, this cartoon is against women voting. And I thought it was an interesting example because in both cases, you have an allegorical figure. The one on the left has the allegorical figure of justice, represented as a woman in white robes. And she's sort of, justice is on the side of the unenfranchised woman. In this case, you have this allegorical figure of womanhood. So this is like the ideal woman and womanhood. It looks almost exactly like the representation of justice, but it's a different allegory. And she's sort of standing in the foreground with a banner held up that says, "No votes, thank you," while in the back you have the suffragette who's, you know, running with a dangerous looking hammer that has a pointy end, and a little flag that says votes. That's how you can identify that as a suffragette. And she looks angry and she looks violent, and is contrasted to that ideal woman who looks very serene and placid and regal even. The contrast there is showing that the women who aren't agitating for the vote are so much better than those crazy, violent, loud women who want it. That's a very different. So when we're talking about framing, this is an example of two different versions of framing. And the one on the right is invoking a dominant discourse about what is womanhood, the idea that a proper woman would not be trying to get the vote. Is part of the dominant discourse that's being invoked there. Notice too, the little details here. We can tell that one of these is American. We've got Uncle Sam. The other one is actually British. You've got Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament as the backdrop there in the one on the right. Britain and the United States were going through this idea of women's suffrage almost at the same time in the early 20th century. Okay, so when we're analyzing discourse, we want to identify the topic that's under conversation. Then we want to make sure we're identifying the discourse community, and that can have to do with time, place. It could even be more narrow than that if it has to do with, you know, like we talked about, specific profession or a specific localized group of some kind. So we want to make sure we're identifying the discourse community. We want to determine what are the types of discourse. You know, dominant discourses are always good to identify, unless we're in a situation where there is none because it's competing. And subversive, you want to identify both the dominant and subversive discourse. Then we want to analyze the framing. We did a little bit of that in the last example, and we'll do a little bit more. And then we want to explain the significance of that representation. And again, this is when especially when we're talking about literature, we want to do all that good identification work, but we also want to think about why is that representation important in the literary text. Okay, so let's look at another example, and we'll stick with this same topic of suffrage. So here's another cartoon. The topic we know is suffrage, women's right to vote. And again, our discourse community is the periodical reading public of the early 20th century, and in this case, America. Now let's think about our types of discourse we could be dealing with here and the specific framing. So we see the flag votes for women, everybody looks happy. Notice these are all men, and they're men of lots of different types. We can see there's farmers, there's merchants, there's labor, there's clerks. So it's a whole variety of men. They all look happy, they're all marching together in solidarity, and it's all different classes and types, and they're holding this flag that says votes for women. So this seems to be a pro-suffrage cartoon that is making the argument that good men are in favor of women voting. That's invoking some dominant discourses like, you know, the opinions of men are really important in this culture. And it's also invoking that subversive discourse that women should be granted the right to vote. All right, let's take a look at this one. So this has got a title, Origin and Development of a Suffragette. And then it's got a little rhyme that's got some pictures that go along with it. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. And notice she's also got this like this deathly looking axe and the votes for women that designate her. So we are starting to get this idea that this kind of axe tool was another one of these symbols for suffragettes in the iconography of the early 20th century. So let's look at this one. It's obviously invoking a lot of ideas about femininity. Coquette is a word that means like a flirt, basically. It's not a compliment. trying hard to please men. But then at 40, she's not married yet. And of course, you get the idea of the old maid. We still have that idea, I think, in the memory of our culture of the old maid. And obviously the argument that it's making is it's women who can't get husbands and are ticked about not being able to fit in as proper women that turn into these ugly and violent suffragettes who agitate for the right to vote. If we could just get them husbands, they would be fine. Invoking some clear dominant discourses about femininity, both positive and negative views that are sort of stereotypical dominant discourses, and making the argument that it is women who can't live up to the conventional ideal who then become suffragettes. So in each case here, we have really different framing. One on the left, there's not even a woman in that picture, right? It's not invoking anything about femininity, but it's saying that, you're a good man if you support women voting. The caption there, a growing procession, at least is making an argument for growing support for this subversive view. That's also engaging with the dominant discourse that men have a more important voice in culture. And then on the other side, as we've talked about, framed with lots of different representations of femininity and how suffragettes are deviant. They don't conform, they're not able to conform to femininity. And so that becomes anger, and that anger becomes give me the right to vote. The topic was about women's suffrage. The discourse community was the general reading public of the early 20th century. There were different discourses that were used there. There were definitely, both cases, they invoked dominant discourses about both masculinity and femininity. And the framing that was used was to show good men in favor of women's suffrage on the one hand, and then to show how suffragettes are deviants compared to the ideal of femininity on the other hand. And so the significance of the representation in these cases is that it helps us to understand some specific cultural arguments that were deployed in this time for and against women having the right to vote. We actually can see how ideas of gender are very specifically manipulated, how those dominant discourses are used to make arguments in this case. That is how we can start getting into that notion of significance. Hopefully that gives you a good introduction to the idea of discourse, and you're beginning to see how we can use discourse to understand literature within specific cultural contexts.